everyone, this is Miff, your life and performance coach, and welcome to the Actually You Can podcast. Actually You Can is more than just a fun phrase to say. It's a philosophy of limitless potential, a mindset, an attitude, a conviction. Most importantly, it's about to make you achieve what you might never have thought possible. On this show, we discuss strategies for growth for ambitious individuals looking to achieve big things and live a thriving, fulfilled life. You'll hear from inspiring guests who will share their journeys, challenges, and lessons learned. And I'll be sharing insights and actionable takeaways from my aligned results framework that will help you to align your goals, mindset, and strategies to reach your highest potential. Be sure to hit subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to so you can easily find this podcast again and stay updated with new episodes dropping every week. Today we're talking about how to master your reading habits and apply what you learn with Nick Hutchinson. Nick is the visionary force behind the marketing agency BookThinkers. In just over 7 years, he has organically built a platform that reaches over 1 million people each month. Nick's podcast, BookThinkers, Life-Changing Books, is a global top 2% show that features captivating interviews with world-class authors such as Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes, and Alex Hormozi. We'll discuss everything there is to know about how you can transform information into life-changing results. Thanks for joining me, Nick. It's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Hi, Miff. You are awesome. And I'd like to ask the first question today, if that's okay with you.
Sure, let's roll with this.
I love it. So we just wrapped up 2023, and you said to me before we pressed record that you felt called out a little bit by my book. So that means you're a reader. So I'm curious, what was the best book that you read last year?
Ooh, great question. See, this is why I feel so called out because I have a bookshelf of beautiful books, just like you and your background. And it's hard for me to go, hang on, what were the key takeaways? So I would say one of my favorite books that I keep coming back to is Do the Work by Stephen Pressfield. Not a big book by any stretch of the means, a nice little one, but for some reason, Stephen Pressfield's work keeps coming back to me.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite people of all time. We've had the chance to interview him a few times. And right now, I'm actually reading a brand new book that he just put out called The Daily Pressfield. So every day, it's just a small little passage about overcoming resistance. And I'm such a big fan of his. So I try to read that before I start my workday every day.
Amazing. And so you've given a little bit of a clue as to what you're all about. We're here to talk specifically about your book, and we'll go into that in more detail. But for the listeners, I would love for you to introduce yourself and share a bit more what it is that you do.
Sure, I'll give a few more clues. So my name is Nick Hutchinson. I'm in the Boston, Massachusetts, USA area. And I'm the founder of a company called BookThinkers. It's a digital marketing agency that helps nonfiction authors promote and market their books. Um, to continue to grow my business, I also have a podcast where I interview world-class authors like Stephen Pressfield and so many other amazing people. We have a large social media following because we post a new book recommendation every day. And then like you talked about, I also just put out my first book, Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn.
Amazing. And I have listened to your podcast before, and you touched on just the caliber of guests you've had on the show. What other sorts of names have you had on that show?
Oh, we have so many amazing people. From big names, famous entrepreneurs like Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes, Alex Hormozi, Patrick Bet-David, to people that focus on very specific things. One of my favorite guests of all time is Vanessa Van Edwards. She's written a couple books like Cues and Captivate, all about the science of succeeding with people, body language, charisma. And then I love philosophers or people that talk about human nature. We've interviewed Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene, and the list goes on. Just so many amazing people out there.
And so, which leads to your book, which is called Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. And I can imagine just with the amount of books that you've read and the quality of guests that you've interviewed, you've been exposed to an incredible amount of knowledge and diverse knowledge at that. So I'm curious to understand what sparked your journey to decide to write this book?
Well, over the years of building my business and my community, just like you said, I've had a chance to interact with many authors, but also many, many, many times more readers. So on Instagram, for instance, today, I think we have 150, 160,000 followers, and we get questions, all types of questions. And I've been getting them for years like, hey, Nick, how do I choose the right book to solve this problem? Or how do I choose the right book to build that skill set? How do I take effective notes? How do I get more from the books I'm reading? How do I retain more? How do I implement more? I mean, I love these questions, and I wish there was just a book or a resource that I could send people to that had all of the answers, but I couldn't find one. And so a couple of years ago, I just decided, you know what? I think it's time for me to go through this experience myself and write my first book. And so that's what I decided to do. And I totally underestimated how difficult it was to write a great book. So I spent years and years and years kind of researching and writing and interviewing people and thinking about how to get the most out of these books. Because just like you highlighted, so many people, they intend on changing their lives by reading these books, but most of the time, nothing changes. And so I really am out here trying to solve that problem.
It sounds like the universe was like, there's nothing out here because you're meant to write this book.
That yeah, as Pressfield would call it, the muse, like this third party energy was kind of flowing through me and I had an opportunity to capitalize on it. It just wouldn't leave me alone. It's like it wanted me to bring it into existence. And you know what? I believe that the right book at the right time can change your life. Writing a book can do
Mhm.
that, but what I mean is consuming a book. I mean, as human beings, no problem is unique. And I think a lot of times we get caught up because we think that our lives, because they're so complex, that they are unique and that nobody else has ever gone through what we're going through. But the fact is, about 100 billion people have lived before us, and millions of them have figured it out. They've lived great lives where they're healthy, they're wealthy, they're happy, they have great relationships. And so many of them have documented their greatest life lessons in the form of a book. And so I think reading is such a beautiful way to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be because books solve problems. Books build skill sets, they satisfy curiosities, they expand what you think is possible. And, I just, at some point, I realized if nobody else was going to teach this stuff, then I have to teach this stuff.
Incredible. And you've just described exactly how I feel about books. And one of the challenges I have is making sure I squeeze all of the juice that I can out of a book. You mentioned the word consume. I feel like it's really easy just to consume stuff. You're reading the pages of a book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and you're like, yes, I'm reading, I'm understanding the words. But when you come to close the book, you're like, hang on a minute. What did I actually learn? Or what has changed as a result?
Yeah. When I first started reading, which was about 10 years ago for me, I didn't start reading these types of books until I was about 20 years old. So when I first started reading, I was reading all different types of material. I mean, a lot of things for me at the time that I was trying to solve were around personal finance and business and communication. And so that's what I naturally gravitated towards. And I realized, just like you're talking about very quickly, that somebody would say, hey, Nick, what was your favorite takeaway from that book that you were just promoting a couple of months ago? And I'd go, hmm, that's a good question. I don't even really remember. And that's a problem, right? Because if we're spending our hard-earned time and money on these books, we're consuming them, we should get something back for that time and money too. But nobody teaches us, again, nobody teaches us how to implement more information from the books we're reading. And so we're just kind of left to our own devices. And I slowly started to wake up to the fact that I was optimizing for the wrong things, I think a couple of years into this process, right? I was trying to read X number of books per year. I was just trying to check the
Mm.
box. And so I was trying to
Yeah.
read them as fast as possible. I was trying to move on to the next book as fast as possible. But that's not why we're reading these books. We're reading these books to create behavior change, to solve problems, build skills. And that means that you shouldn't optimize for the number of books you're reading. That's a vanity metric. What about optimizing for the number of actions you take from each book you read? And so as I started to change what I was optimizing for, the book started to become a little bit more impactful for me. And I built energy around it, right? I mean, people are asking me, Nick, how do you retain more from books? Well, I don't know. Let me go do some research on that for you, right? All of a sudden, I became this thought leader on reading, which I had never intended to be. And so I do have tons of tips and tricks and strategies, and we could definitely talk about some of them today. But that's kind of the backstory as to why I got into this. And again, I never wanted to be the reading guy, but I ended up as the reading guy. And now I believe in it so much that I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you mentioned chasing the vanity or ego metrics of how many books you can consume as opposed to how many actions you can take. And so I'd love to discuss some of those strategies. How can we optimize for the number of actions we take off the back of a book? Because I'm very much the believer of the knowledge hasn't been learned unless you apply it, or change doesn't happen unless you actually see the action. So how can we optimize for that?
Yeah, I think you'll nerd out on this with me for a minute. So a couple of years ago, I was practicing this funny term that I've coined called book sex, which is where you take two random takeaways from two totally different books and you sort of merge them together and you see what comes out. And so when I was thinking about how to read more efficiently, I took the SMART goal framework, the SMART goal setting
Yep.
framework, and I merged it with setting an intention for each book that we read. And so nowadays, I think one of the best starting points for action is setting an actionable goal for the book. So, for any of your audience that's not familiar with it, I'll quickly go through what SMART stands for. So, SMART is an acronym that stands for specific. Your goal needs to be as specific as possible. You need to know why you're reading the book, not just picking it up and hoping that it's going to change your life, but you need to set a specific goal. M stands for measurable. Your goal needs to be measurable. You need to know whether or not you have achieved the actions that you've set out to accomplish. The legendary management guru, Peter Drucker, he would say, what's not being measured can't be managed. So your goal needs to be measurable. A stands for attainable. Your goal needs to be realistic. Otherwise, you'll kind of like succumb to fear, you'll procrastinate, you won't take action if your goal for the book is too big. R stands for relevant. You need to be emotionally connected to the goal at hand. It needs to solve a problem or build a skill set. And there are ways to amplify your emotional connection to the information that you're learning so that you can retain it more efficiently. T stands for time bound. You want to give yourself a deadline to take action. There's something called Parkinson's Law, which basically says a task will expand to the amount of time that you give it. And so you want to give yourself a deadline to take action on the book that you're reading. And so when you combine all five of these things and you apply a SMART goal to a book, it might sound like this. Instead of just reading Do the Work by Stephen Pressfield, you might set a SMART goal, something like find and implement at least 2 ways to overcome resistance when I'm writing by the end of January. Because I care so much about putting my pen to paper, but I just can't seem to get it there. And I want to share my message with the world, but unless I write something, nobody's going to hear it or see it, right? That's a SMART goal because it's specific. You know exactly what you're looking for. It's measurable. Did you implement at least 1 or 2 new strategies for overcoming resistance in the writing process? Did you do that? You know whether or not you did it. It's attainable. I didn't say like write a book by the end of the month. Just find and implement 2 new strategies for overcoming resistance. You're emotionally connected with it because of all the reasons that I just said, and time bound by the end of January. So what I'll do with that SMART goal, that intention, is I'll write it on the inside cover of the book and I'll review it every time I read another chapter so that I'm sharing my goal with the book so that the book can share only the most important information back with me. Because our brains have this reticular activating system. The RAS is what it's called. And it's our brain's natural filtering mechanism. And so if you share your very specific goal to find actions that you can implement, that's all you're going to see. Everything else melts away. And they'll jump off the page. You'll be like, that's it. That's what I was searching for. It's like a treasure hunt. And so what I guess I'm finishing off this long tangent. There are so many other steps to the process, but I think setting a SMART goal that has action baked into it is the most important piece. And then what I'll say is, once I'm done reading a book, maybe I'll have 10 potential actions that I'd like to implement. I do a quick 80-20 analysis. What 20% of these potential actions are going to create 80% of the change I'm looking for? Because not every action is created equal, and that's what I'll choose to implement. So hopefully that followed. Set a SMART goal and then do an 80-20 analysis, and I think you'll be left with the best actions that you could take to solve your problem or build your skill.
That is incredible. You can clearly tell just how passionate you are about this subject. And I would love to dig into this in more detail, especially starting a book with an intention in mind. So that has been something that has been suggested to me in the past. And I'm starting to think it's just my own excuse for not having done this. But my attitude towards that would be like, oh, but I want to be open to what the book has to offer. What would you say to someone who is resistant? And I guess I could set the goal to overcome this particular resistance, resistant to setting an intention at the start of a book.
I would say reading without intention is toxic. I mean, it's an aggressive statement, but I think you're underserving yourself. You're not living up to your full potential. And at the very least, try it out. Try it out for a few books and see if it
Yeah.
makes a difference. Now, I still leave myself open to whatever message this book might have to teach me. Sometimes it's not related to my intention, but I'll still find something that jumps off the page and it's like, wow, that's life changing. I love the idea of being 3 feet from gold. Like the next page might have a word, a sentence, a paragraph, page worth of information that literally changes your life forever. I mean, it's happened to me so many times. So I definitely remain open to whatever a book has to teach me. But I think that we should grab life by the horns a little bit, read with a little bit more intention,
Yeah.
solve very specific problems, build very specific skills. And that's what these books can do for us.
Yeah, most definitely. It's like you picked up that book for a reason, right? Whether consciously or unconsciously, something attracted you to this book. So you might as well just set an intention for what you hope or could be possible to get from it.
Yes, absolutely. And another way of asking the question that you just asked me is like, does that suck the joy or the fun out of the reading process? I think some people, they'll argue that I'm a little bit too analytical with it. And I'd say again, like discipline equals freedom. That's a Jocko Willink line.
Yes.
He's a US Navy SEAL guy who's famous for saying that. And what he means by that is let's say that you have an 8-hour workday. Well, if you're super disciplined and you don't focus on distractions, you just focus on your work, maybe you get it done in 6 hours and that frees up a few hours of free time to do whatever you want. But if you're not disciplined and you don't focus your attention, maybe it takes you 10 hours to get the 8 hours of work done. That's a 4 hour difference because you couldn't focus. And I think the same thing happens with these books. Like there's an opportunity cost to not reading with intention. You're not getting as much out of the book, and therefore your life isn't where it could be if you decided to read with a little bit more intention, right? These books, they condense decades of somebody else's greatest life lessons into days of reading. So sometimes like I'll joke around with people and I'll say, I'm 30 years old, but if you include the 500 books that I read that each condense decades into days, I'm thousands of years old. And that's how you create progress. You take action on the wisdom that other people are teaching you and recommending. And again, it's not that it sucks the fun out of the process. Like I'm always leveraging the art of anticipation. Like what's on the next page? Is it going to be the next page? So it keeps it fun and different for me. But again, like I think that intention piece, the discipline around stating it to the book and then the book can share it back with you is so powerful.
Yeah, definitely. And even the intention of why you're reading in the first place. Typically, if you're reading a nonfiction book, it is to gain some sort of knowledge and to create some sort of change. What would be your attitude towards fiction books? Would you be giving the same guidance to someone who is reading fiction versus nonfiction?
Not as much. I mean, I think you could state that your intention is just to enjoy the book, to expand your vocabulary, to improve your attention span, to have fun, to escape, to relax. It doesn't need to be as serious. Most of my audience, they're reading the kind of personal development, nonfiction, business style books. And so I think my message sometimes resonates a little bit more with them. I do still consume fiction. It's not a big chunk of what I read at this stage in my life, but fiction is the only place where the impossible becomes possible with the stroke of a pen. And I think that's amazing. I think it's great for exercising creativity, for expanding vocabulary, for escaping, and those are useful things in certain areas of your life.
Yeah, most definitely. And I would love to hear, what are some of the most memorable actions you've taken because of a book?
Ugh, I mean, my life has continued to change over and over and
Mhm.
over and over again. In fact, in the second half of my book, Rise of the Reader, I detail over 100 healthy, wealthy, and happy habits that I've implemented or at least tried out as a result of the books that I've read. So there's 35 healthy habits, 35 wealthy slash productivity habits, and 35 happy habits. And they're all from the books that I've read. So some memorable ones. Here's a good business example about the return on investment from a book. A couple of years ago, my marketing agency was still kind of a side hustle. It was growing. It had just kind of reached a consistent $10,000 a month in recurring revenue, and I read a book called $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozi, and the book is all about offer structure, offer creation. It was a very impressive book, and I half-heartedly implemented it. Like I was looking for ways to modify my existing service set, and in the book, I found a few things to implement and I implemented them. And literally within 3 or 4 months, I had tripled or quadrupled our monthly revenue. So we went from like $10,000 a month to like $40,000 a month. We had a couple of 50,000, like all of a sudden from a book, from a $20 book that I spent a few hours of my time reading. I just needed somebody to give me permission to think about things through a different lens. I applied them
Mm.
directly to my business and then boom, hundreds of thousands of dollars have resulted as a result of reading that book, which is just wild to think about.
Yeah, and a couple of things come up when you mention that. Firstly, you mentioned before that a lot of the problems we're experiencing aren't unique to us. I think we like to think that we are unique. I mean, we are unique, but we have unique problems. But the general theme of them, there are other humans out there who have had these problems before and who have solved them. So the answers are out there if we're willing to look for them. So there's that one part where it's like you had the ability to go, I'm experiencing this generic, I'm doing air quotes, information could be of service to me. And so I think there's that element, but there's also the element of that book cost $20. And you're like, well, what value possibly could a $20 book offer me? Shouldn't I have to pay $10,000 for valuable information? I think that's where books can kind of get a bit of a bad rap too, because they're so accessible that people might underestimate the value that you can actually achieve from a book.
Yeah, I think so too. I had a mentor of mine tell me recently that he would rather read somebody's book than pay for a one on one coaching session. And a one on one coaching session with some of these people that have been on my podcast and that we're reading their books, I mean, that could be tens of thousands of dollars for a 1 hour session, right? Maybe even more. And their book is $20. So I said, why would you rather read the book? And he said, the book took them decades to live and write. It's their best advice, like perfectly stated in a digestible format. And it took them years to get it there and simplify it so that you can digest and implement it. If you had a 1 hour coaching session with that person, I mean, it's not the best representation of their information. And you walk out of the session and you have to, now it's over. Whereas like you can return to a book over and over and over and over again. And let's just say, you learn somebody's offer creation format or something like that and apply it to your business, like I did with the $100 million example. Um, I can go back to that book over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I always have it with me and I don't have to pay for another coaching session. And I just think that it's such a fun way to think about it.
Yeah. And so with the books that you read, do you go and revisit them, or do the strategies that you implement mean that there is no need for you? You've taken what you need from that book?
I would argue that you can never read the same book twice. And
Yeah.
I guess I first started thinking about it. I think there's like an older, maybe like Buddhist proverb or story, which basically says like you can never step in the same river twice because the river has changed, right? It's not the same water and you have also changed. And then so I thought about
Yeah.
that and I merged it with the book concept. So you can never read the same book twice because you have changed. And the lens through which you're reading the book and the problems that you're using the book to solve are different and they're updated and you've grown. And like there are some books that I've read 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and it's never the same book. I always find something that I totally missed or didn't realize was important the first or second time through. And I'm always surprised at how that happens. So let's say I've read 500 books. I probably have a top 5%, meaning
Wow.
25 books have created 95% of the change out of the 500 I've read. And so I'll consistently go back to those books over and over and over again in different formats and different stages of life. And like I said, it's not even the same book anyway, right? These books change with us.
Yeah. Do you think there is such thing as a bad book?
Yes, I do. And I've read a couple of them.
What makes a good yeah, what makes a good and a bad book in your opinion?
Well, I think a bad book fails to meet some of the basic requirements of a book, right? There are misspellings and typos in the first couple of pages. It's not formatted correctly. Um, the grammar is off. People are making things up. They're lying with statistics. Nothing is backed the reference points aren't there. Table of contents is all met. Like that happens from time to time. Obviously, we choose not to represent or promote those books in my business. I think that's what makes a bad book. I think what makes an average book is everything is done the right way, all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, but there's nothing different. There's nothing useful. The book isn't actionable. It's just philosophy or something like that. And I think, and again, I'm kind of speaking through the lens of just personal development style books. And I think what makes a great book is there's something unique, there's something different, and it's actionable. It's as actionable as humanly possible. It is the responsibility of the reader to take action on what they've learned to create behavior change. But I think that a great author can make that easier by recommending specific exercises or things to implement. Make it as easy as possible for that person to use what you've learned. And that's hard to do, by the way, to simplify information and make it usable for other people. No small feat. But that's, I think, what a great book does. And when you think about some of the best books of all time in the personal development space, again, is kind of where I'm talking. They stand the test of time. They're consistently sold over and over and over again, even if the author isn't alive today, because
Yep.
word of mouth happens. And word of mouth only happens when a book is great and it changes your behavior. And somebody goes, "Hey, how'd you lose that weight?" Or "How'd you afford that car?" Or "Why are you so happy? Why is your relationship so great?" Well, it's this book. And that's how a book gets passed on, because people take action on it and it creates a word of mouth sort of viral momentum, and it sells forever that way.
Yeah, I love that, and someone that comes to mind immediately is someone like Brian Tracy. His books are passed down, they're still in corporate environments today and that sort of stuff. You mentioned as well in books that there's exercises, and you get nonfiction books that don't have exercises and some that do, and I feel like a lot of people might not actually go through the exercises in a nonfiction book. What's your view on that? And what would be your advice to someone who's going, "Oh, I don't need to do those exercises?"
Yeah, I mean, I was that person for a long time too, right? Because I was optimizing again for the wrong thing. How do I finish reading the book as fast as possible and get on to the next one? By just reading about the exercise, not actually doing it. And then I don't think I'll ever make that mistake again because of that $100 million offers
Mm.
example from Alex Hormozi. I mean, I stopped, I did the exercises, and I've made hundreds of thousands of dollars in the last couple of years as a
Yeah.
result of one exercise in a book, just one. So again, it's
Wow.
that idea of 3 feet from gold is like, you never know what exercise is going to change everything to you for you. And there's no downside to doing an exercise other than maybe a little bit of money or time, depending on what it is. But I think that they're always worth trying out because you don't know what's on the other side of that exercise.
Yeah.
And the author wouldn't put it in there if it wasn't important. So yeah, I say don't bypass them because there's an opportunity cost to that, and you don't want to figure out what that is later in life.
Yeah, they're there for a reason, right? And if you're avoiding them, then you should probably check out why you're avoiding them too. Do you actually want to do the work? Do you actually want to move through whatever it is that you're experiencing? Or do you just like the idea of it?
Yeah, that's a great point too. I think there's a great book called The Mastery of Self by Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And he talks about points of resistance like that. So if you don't want to do the exercises, or you don't want to finish a book, or you don't, trust the information that the author is saying, do a little bit of a deep dive, a personal inventory. Try to figure out why it irritates you, why it triggers you, why you don't want to go through it. Because maybe there is some type of hidden fear or limiting belief that you can discover and then as a result be aware of and remove. So I think sometimes it's a fear of success or whatever the case is, fear of failure, fear of judgment. There's so many different
Yeah.
reasons that we fail to take action. And yeah, pause in those moments when you feel the resistance and try to think like, what is this coming from?
You'll learn about yourself. It might not be what you thought you were going to learn from the book, but you'll definitely learn something.
Yes, yeah, very true. Very true.
And so you mentioned that really great strategy of setting an intention and a SMART goal for a book. Are there any other tools that we can use to get the most out of a book? So some things that come to mind is I have friends who might underline hardcover book or they'll put sticky notes in a book. I on a Kindle. Is there a preferred method to read? I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, I'll tackle the method piece first. I think either a physical paper book or a Kindle is a better option than just an audiobook. And here's why. 80% of the inputs to our brain, 80% are visual. 80. So by default, if you're only listening to information, it's going to be harder for you to form a meaningful relationship to what you've learned, store it,
Yeah.
organize it properly, be able to retain and access it. And most of the time, when people are just listening to information, they are multitasking. They're driving in the car,
Yes.
they are working out, they're at the gym, they're doing chores, they're doing busy work. And so you have to give the book a shot to change your life. And if you're multitasking, you're not really focused on it, and you're not even reading the information, the chances that it's going to change your life are pretty low. So I read most of the content that I consume, right? The books that I'm reading. I like physical paper books because just like you mentioned, I like to write inside of my books. The Kindle is sort of growing on me a little bit. Again, I just prefer the physical sort of tactile experience of a physical paper book. One of my mentors, Kevin Horsley, he says that reading a physical book is like using a paper map in your car. It's just inefficient. Like nobody does that anymore. We all have a GPS. And what he means is that with a Kindle, you can highlight your notes, you can export your notes, you can take additional notes, you can look up definitions in real time if you're connected to the internet. You can carry 10,000 books in one Kindle versus like you'd have to lug around suitcases and stuff if they were physical books. So he kind of makes that analogy, and I get it, but I really just love physical paper books. Here's a strategy that I mentioned that always gets the book purists a little crazy and up in arms. I actually recommend ripping pages out. So, yeah, I could see your face. So, let's say my intention is to, again, back to the do the work, Stephen Pressfield. My intention is to find and implement at least two strategies to overcome resistance in my writing by the end of January. And I get to a page and there's the strategy. Like that's the thing that I need to do.
Yes.
I just rip it right out and I carry it with me all day. And so every time I'm like in my pocket for my phone, I also see the paper, I take it out, I read it again. And the something else Kevin Horsley taught me is that repetition leads to retention. And so the more often you can review information, the more likely you are to be able to retain and implement it. And so again, what's a great way to review information? Rip that page out and keep it with you all day. And you'll remember the experience. It'll be experiential. You'll be like, I can't believe I just did that. You'll post about it on socials and be like, has anybody else ever ripped a page off? Like, please don't unfollow me. And I mean, seriously, whenever I post about that, people literally comment unfollowed. It's like, I think it's funny. You buy the book so that it can change your life, and then you're like offended if you're right in it or something.
I love that strategy. So I'm just staring at my vision board. I'm definitely a visual person and I can appreciate the power of having visual reminders of what you're working towards or strategies or what you want to learn. So I actually really love that. I think I might start ripping some pages out.
Yes. Yes, please do. I almost thought in my book as like a fun design element when I talk about that to have like the little scissors down the side of the page or something like tear it out, cut it out. So I'll have to get that done in the next version.
Yeah, next edition, perforated pages.
Yeah, I love it.
So you mentioned that having the visual reminder can help you implement stuff from a book. Do you believe that there's a capacity or a time at which you can move on to the next book? So do you move on to the next book if and only when you've completed the SMART goals from the previous book? Or what's your strategy around moving from one book to another book?
All right, this might be kind of hard to follow, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. I think that reading and implementing are two totally separate activities, and we should constantly be doing both. And here's what I mean by that. I've read too many productivity books to think that any form of multitasking is a good idea. And so reading is sort of this passive visual input to our brain, whereas taking notes and implementing information can come in all different shapes and forms, and it can get kind of crazy and complex. And so in my calendar, I try to keep very specific reading schedules. And when I'm reading, I will stop and circle page numbers. I'll highlight stuff. I'll rip out a page, whatever the case is. But I try not to take action in that moment for a couple of reasons. Number one, you don't know if the strategy on the next page is going to be 10 times better than the one you just read. So I think like the ripping the page out example, I still do that from time to time, but I always make sure to finish a book before I really start to take action. You want to take action on the most efficient things, right? So when we finish the reading experience, we do that 80-20 analysis, and we only take action on the 20% of takeaways that are going to create 80% of the change. Then when I finish the book, I kind of move on right to the next book. I don't want to lose that reading momentum, but I have separate times in my calendars where I'm taking action on the books that I'm reading. And again, I think that's just kind of like a separate activity. So I never want to lose my reading momentum. And kind of going back to the Stephen Pressfield, since you're a fan of him, he told me one time that he gets, I think, a third of the way into his next book before he stops and takes a break. So he doesn't stop when he finishes writing a book. He continues that momentum all the way into the next book where he's far enough in that he knows if he takes a break, at least he won't lose that momentum. He can start up again. And I try to think about that same thing with reading. Is like, if you read and then implement, that's kind of a slow, chaotic process. But if you constantly read, let's just say every morning for a half an hour, and then throughout your day, you're sporadically trying out the different things that you've read and you're implementing information. And sometimes implementing something from a book could take 6 months. Sometimes it could just take 5 minutes. So I think they're different kind of categories in my mind.
Yeah, and I love how you've got the separate calendar times for both of those activities. And so I'd love to hear a bit more. What's some specific habits you have around reading and implementation? You mentioned your calendar. Is there a set amount of time you spend reading each day or taking action, or does it vary as well?
It definitely varies. I try to schedule at least 10 hours of reading time into my schedule each week. And most of the time, that's like 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, and then a little bit more time on the weekends, depending on schedule and availability and that kind of stuff. And then I jokingly say if I spend an hour a day reading, 8 hours a day sleeping, I spend the rest of the time implementing the information I've read,
Sure.
because I'm applying it to my business and my relationships and my health. And those are the things that take up the rest of my time. Um, so when I meet people sometimes and they're like, "Hey Nick, I appreciate this conversation, but I'm not much of a reader." I like to push back on that a little bit. Sometimes people tell me they don't have enough time to read. And so I'll normally follow up like this. I'll say, "Hey Mick, if I paid you $10,000 to read a book by the end of the month, do you think you could do it?" And you'd be like, "Yeah." And then I go, "Okay, great. You've fallen into my trap," right? Because you've admitted that you could read if you thought it was more valuable, but currently you don't read, right? It's not a question of whether or not we have enough time. It's a question of whether or not we value reading enough to prioritize it over other things in our schedules. So if anybody is just starting out in today's audience, I recommend instead of trying to find time to read, just replace a little bit of time in the morning and a little bit of time in the evening of a low impact activity with reading a great book. And here's kind of what that looks like for me. In the morning, if you could just replace a little bit of social media scrolling with reading a great book, that's what we're aiming for. And if you could just replace a little bit of your Netflix or whatever you're watching in the evening, TV, social media, with reading a great book, that's what we're aiming for. So 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, that's 30 minutes of reading per day. If you're brand new to the space and you're a little bit of a slower reader, you might average 20 pages for every 30 minutes that you read. You do that Monday through Friday, 20 times 5, that's 100 pages a week. That's 200 pages every 2 weeks. And most of these books are only 200 pages long or less. Like Pressfield stuff is all less than that. So you can literally read 2 books a month following that 15-minute twice a day schedule. And I think that's how fast it can work for people.
And I love that you provided such actionable steps there. And if someone's looking for something to do in the next 24 to 48 hours, do that. Spend that amount of time subbing out your social media or TV time to read a book. And I'd love to finish off, Nick, by asking you, if someone's like, well, why should I do that? Why should I read books? What would you say to them, and what impacts have books had on your life?
I would say this. We all have problems in our lives, all of us. And if you don't deal with a problem that happens on a daily basis, it will occur 11,000 more times over the next 30 years. And that math is pretty scary. But 365 times 30 is about 11,000. So again, if you have a problem in your life and it causes you pain or discomfort or anxiety, and you don't deal with it, you'll have to experience that pain, that discomfort, that anxiety 11,000 more times over the next 30 years. But remember, like Mifnaf talked about, other people have solved that problem before, and it might have taken them 20 or 30 years to figure it out. But here's the key. They wrote about it in a great book that you can read in just a few hours of your time. And you can spend the next couple of weeks solving that problem, and then you can be free of it for the next 10,950 experiences, right? You can go without the pain. So I guess the message there is that life doesn't have to be so hard. There have been some amazing men and women that have come before us, and they've dedicated their lives to figuring it out for us. And then they detailed the entire blueprint. They made it available, sometimes for almost nothing. And that's what I would say. I think that's why I read these books. Again, they solve problems. They make life better. You can be happy. You can be healthy. You can be wealthy. You can have amazing relationships. And the world's best mentors are available to you, and you don't need to pay a lot of money to experience what they have to teach you.
That's incredible. Mic drop moment there. I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. So thank you so much, Nick, for your time today and for sharing your expertise and your thousands of years of knowledge with us today. It's so appreciated.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
If people are looking to learn more about what it is that you do or to grab a copy of your book, where can they do that?
My book, Rise of the Reader, is available in every major online retailer. So I think for most of us, that might mean Amazon, but there are a bunch of them. And where can people find me? Our most vibrant community, our biggest following is on Instagram, BookThinkers. And so if anybody wants to join a tribe of really motivated, really cool personal development style readers and thinkers, the comment section every day on our posts is always a lot of fun. And there's a bunch of cool people you can meet. So that's where I would recommend that people go.
Amazing. I'll put those details in the show notes. But thank you so much again, Nick. It's been a pleasure to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of the Actually You Can podcast. I so enjoy having you here, and I hope you've taken away powerful insights and tools that will support you to achieve your high-level results. Now, before you go apply all of this wisdom in your life, I would be so grateful if you are able to leave us a podcast review on the platform that you're listening to, or share this episode with a friend. Your support means that we can help more self-led, high-performing individuals just like you expand what's possible for them. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on today's episode, so please go on and shoot me a note on socials and let me know what you think. You can find me on Instagram at MiffGalloway. Now, go ahead and make those dreams a reality, because actually, you can.